Hello, it's so good to finally be here. We've been prepping for this for a while. Thanks for having me as well. I'm going to talk about something a little different. While Darpa does a lot, as Stephanie mentioned earlier, in the world of AI, when we talk about things like human-machine teaming, we don't often think about ways to measure and understand what happens when human-machine teams scale. And so what I'm going to talk today is about scalable human-machine ecosystems. So whether it's advancing artificial theory of mind or creating the next killer app, these are things that have become quickly ubiquitous in our world. Of course, this isn't new. Since our species has existed, our societies have been shaped by the tools that we have developed to help us initially with just simple tasks. But then with the agricultural revolution, we looked at ways in which the plow and advents in animal husbandry and other farming tools helped create new relationships between individuals and the state, in fact, when they could produce more than they could consume. And so happening, you find out that things like the communal farming systems of rice regions in the area, you end up seeing that the state wasn't even possible if it weren't for a change in society that came along with that revolution. Similarly, along with the technological or the industrial revolution, we see that the rise of companies which had power alongside the state, you also see societal implications. And then most recently, of course, with our communications revolution, we see societies and societal implications that, of course, transcend geographical boundaries. Now, what's next? As we see machines and intelligent machines infiltrate much broader areas of our lives, we ask the question here today of how do we build scalable human-machine ecosystems that are both prosperous and resilient? And so in so doing, we're going to talk about scaffoldings. Now, it's because we can't grow an ecosystem, or we can't build an ecosystem, but we can grow one. And think about how we do that. Instead of thinking about just the machines and just the team members, we can instead think about, or additionally think about, things like incentives that drive the behaviors we want. We can also think about conditions under which these ecosystems can work, and additionally think about healthy tensions that drive and accelerate development in these areas in the same way that ecological pressures can drive evolution. We don't have to look far to see examples of how human-machine partnerships are changing the face of competition today, something that Phil just spoke about. A couple examples here to really illustrate it. First is an example of how our highly efficient peacetime supply chains have led to really brittle capabilities or really brittle problems in the face of disruption. One UN report estimated that we would see an additional 50 million people suffering destabilizing hunger as a result of the conflict in Ukraine. That's a result of a system highly adapted to one kind of condition, peacetime, not doing so well in the face of disruption. In another example, we see individuals taking upon themselves to independently attack Russian websites at the beginning of this war. We see grandmothers enabled by smartphones revealing the position of enemy forces, of Russian forces. That kind of empowerment of the individual is a hallmark of the current situation we are in and unlikely to dissipate. Speed is another hallmark of this current environment and what we can expect to see in the future. In this example, it was after just a single encounter with Russian jamming, Starlink was able to push a security patch overnight that thwarted Russia's attempts to shut down Ukrainian communications and access to the internet. So this also demonstrates the power a single individual can have, good or bad, things like how we protect our energy grids. So we need to think about, at the ecosystem level, things that we can't think about at the unit level, features that don't emerge at the unit level that we can study at this broader level. So these are capabilities, though, right? Why talk about scaffoldings? They're a little boring. Maybe not. And I'd say there's actually good historical precedents for why we might want to look at a scaffolding. The first example I have is the Pacific Railway Act of 1864. This is best known for creating the first transcontinental railroad. What's less known about this, or less well known about this, is that it also standardized gauges between all the rail companies. Prior to this, what you saw is that each independent company, each railway company, had their own gauges, and the gauges are the width of the rail and the distance between them. And as a result, northern trains couldn't run on southern track, and neither could go west. But by standardizing the gauge, what you see in the following 10 years is a vast expansion of railway across the United States. And additionally, the emergence of a United States identity, what it means to be American. This effectively reduced the time it took a person to reach the West from Omaha, Nebraska, from 6 months by wagon to 4 days by train. And so it was the scaffolding that enabled this. And it also, these new ecosystems, a feature of ecosystems in general is that they lead to new niches and the need for new innovations to keep things healthy at scale. In this case, it was the emergence of time zones. We needed time zones in order to manage the departures and the arrivals of this ever-growing network. On the right, of course, we have something that's quite close to our hearts here at Darpa. This is the ARPANET of 1969. And it had a similar effect. This, along with standard messaging protocols, we ended up seeing, we didn't grow the internet, or we didn't design the internet, we grew it collectively as a society, as an ecosystem. Both of these cases, it was the interplay between the government creating the scaffolds and industry driving development that led to the vast and rapid expansion of the system, the emergence of entirely new ecosystems and new industries, and the rapid societal change that we've experienced. And of course, it's not all good, of course. Along with some of that prosperity comes some of the more negative sides. This is an example that one think tank put out showing the number of countries whose election systems have been adversely affected by some kind of technological capability. And just as the Industrial Revolution led to some unhealthy societal side effects as well, like child labor, rapid urbanization without sanitation, this is the outcome of our current information revolution. It's also an example of the wrong incentive structures, where it can lead and to exacerbate the worst parts of ourselves, rather than creating echo chambers, for instance, as an emergence of a scaling of confirmation bias. So the question here is, are there innovations, like time zones were for the rail system, are there innovations that we can use to maintain healthy systems at scale? Those that bring out the best of humans rather than the worst. This, of course, does require a different way of thinking, a different approach. It means that when we think about human-machine teams and ecosystems, it's not just the realm of the engineer, but also includes areas in economics, maybe behavioral sciences even. And we don't have to scale far in order to see some of the initial effects of what happens when you start to broaden human-machine teams. This is a study that came out of Chris Wickens' lab, looking at it's a meta-analysis of a number of studies that looked at the ability of an individual to oversee highly automated systems, right? And what it plots is the studies from least automated, system under test, to highly automated, and then along the y-axis, it is a normalized measure of human performance, or the ability of a single individual to oversee multiple functions. So the more functions a single person can have, the higher on the x-axis. Of course, what you see is that the green line is exactly what we hope to achieve, that with increased automation, we get increased capability. Unfortunately, this only holds under expected conditions. The red line shows us what happens in off-nominal conditions, or those that were unexpected, whether it's a system failure or it's an unexpected condition. This says the more automated the system, the more catastrophic the fail. This is, of course, not what we want, especially in highly unexpected conditions that we see in military contexts. Now, whereas the prevailing thinking has been just push down cognitive workload and the human should be able to figure it out when something goes wrong, the blue diamonds indicate that at reduced workload, that doesn't necessarily work. And I would argue that something that we're missing is the proper scaffolding of how to transfer information between our machine counterparts and our human operators that enable the person to be able to exert appropriate levels of control over the system, even in the face of unexpected consequences. Can that person adapt the system? So in addition to different approaches, we might also need to think more carefully about what we want to measure and what good looks like. And for this, I'm going to turn to something a little bit different. This is DoD Directive 3000.09, or Department of Defense Directive 3000.09, which is what put a line in the sand and said that autonomous and semi-autonomous systems shall be built in a way so that commanders and operators can exercise appropriate level of human judgment over the use of force. This is about 10 years old, but more recently, the DoD also adopted what are known as responsible AI principles. So responsibility, equity, transparency, traceability, and governability. Put a little bit more meat on the bone. What do we mean by responsible AI? And this is wonderful. This shows us really forward-thinking, establishing early that we want to create systems that are in line with our values as a nation. But it also begs the question of how on earth do you measure it? How do you know when you've got responsible oversight? How do you know when a person has enough understanding of a system that they can exert responsible oversight and control? So this is, and I would offer that we've done a lot of good work on explainable AI in DARPA, but a different question would be, how much knowledge and understanding do you need to have to operate it? Do we need computer scientists running these systems? I don't necessarily think so. In the same way that you don't need to be a chemist in order to understand what cold weather does to your electric car's battery. It's going to shorten your range. Similarly, I don't think operators need necessarily a detailed understanding of how these systems work, but the question of how much is still open. This has also been a subject of some work we've done here at DARPA in particular looking at how do you bake in legal, moral, ethical considerations in the process of building these systems, and what we call the, not after the fact when the system is developed, but during the paper to prototype phase, before the system even exists. And we've had some really exciting results from that. So I'm going to turn a little bit now to say, what makes these so difficult at scale? What makes socio-technical systems so hard to understand at scale? I'm going to touch on just a couple of things. I'm sure you can imagine a number of others. The first is, and this is just an example of a simple agent-based model and how quickly it can become complex at scale. But these systems are not just complicated, they are complex, meaning they're non-deterministic, and you cannot predict an output for a given input. Makes it really hard for our traditional reductionist methods to study. Additionally, they are not just nonlinear, they're non-ergodic, meaning because they are evolving, they are never the same thing twice. So even if you have a perfect model of a system today, it will inherently decay over time, and the more dynamic that system, the faster it'll decay. They're self-reflexive. This is a wonderful feature of humans, a second-order chaotic system, and if you make a prediction, human will immediately react to it, therefore invalidating the prediction. That's both a challenge and an opportunity, I would offer. They're also, as I mentioned earlier, extremely fast. Human-machine teams allow faster actions at scale, and if we are not purposeful in our own design, we may end up with systems that empower our reactionary knee-jerk responses rather than the measured and more thoughtful and innovative responses that lead to better outcomes. So what can we do in this space then? How can we start thinking about this space? Well, ways in we can begin to break down and characterize the nature of these human-machine teams, the scaffoldings and the combinations. Think, for instance, about can we characterize them along lines such as, obvious things, team size, complexity, how heterogeneous is it, how evenly distributed is that heterogeneity, how many coordination mechanisms would it then require because of how distributed that heterogeneity is. What are the temporal features? How fast is fast? Do we have to consider designing things that make room for that purposeful thought that we want our human partners to be able to exert and influence within the system? There's other dimensions like how are responsibilities divided? Can every agent do every other agent's job, or are there certain divisions? We've already talked about one division in 3000.09, right? Humans exert oversight. And our team members self-reflexive and aware. This is merely just the surface. Again, I'm interested in other ways to break this down and to think more clearly about these human-machine ecosystems at scale so we can better understand them and get them to give rise to the features we want. So DARPA has done some work in this area, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the programs we have in this space in a number of different categories, if you will. So the first are programs that help machines aid humans, and then humans that can aid machines. Our In the Moment program, or ITM, is looking at whether you can create trusted algorithms that are aligned with human decision makers that can be trusted then for life and death decisions, such as in cases of medical triage, where easy answers just may not exist. In the EDGE program, the Enhancing Design for Graceful Extensibility program, we're dealing with that question of how do you create the human-machine interfaces that enable an operator to adapt with that system on the fly in the face of unexpected considerations and consequences. Another set of programs we have is focused on making AI a better partner. The KMAS program, if any of you have recently switched jobs, you realize that it takes about 3 to 6 months to get up to speed with all the unwritten rules of a given organization. Well, KMAS is aimed at that problem, looking at capturing institutional knowledge and delivering it just enough of it and just in time to just the right person. And then the Science of Artificial Intelligence and Learning for Open World Novelty program, or SAILON, that one also is pushing the science of AI to do what it really doesn't do so well, which is can it not only understand when it encounters novelty, but handle it when it does. In another area, we're looking at the social science to improve AI and how AI can improve social science. The ASSIST program, or Artificial Social Intelligence for Successful Teams, is looking a lot at that shared theory of mind and can it lead to better performance outcomes of teams. And the Habitus program is looking at AI tools to scale something called participatory modeling. So even though we collect a lot of big data across the world, understanding it locally really matters. We often interpret it through a Western lens. This program, by creating hyperlocal causal models from local knowledge, can interpret those data through a local lens and thus help decision makers. Now, well, I find all of what DARPA is doing to be really exciting. There's even more exciting, I think, is looking forward to what we could do, what you can do in this space. And some of the inspiration, so what I have here is just a couple of examples of things that I think are both inspiring and studies that give me hope to think that we can really do something cool in this area. So scaffolds provide the structure upon which ecosystems grow. But incentives, as I mentioned earlier, incentives, conditions, intentions. Incentives provide the driving force that generates growth, can drive it in either adaptive or maladaptive directions. This study from Mann and Helbig this is a simplified model, granted, but it is studying what kind of incentive structures lead to better outcomes in a task of predicting market outcomes. And what they find is that, in this case, an incentive structure that did not incentivize diminishing a minority view performed other kinds of incentive structures. Now, again, this isn't a simple model, but this tells us a couple of things. First is that it adds to increasing evidence we see about the importance of cognitive diversity to giving rise to collective intelligence, and how, while before we were looking at mass specialization as a means to advance and to innovate, we're now seeing that something a little different, that cognitive diversity, different perspectives, different experiences can also be really helpful. This model is really helpful, but it also asks the question, how can we set the incentives when things are much more complex than this? When components are heterogeneous and diverse, when events are both cyclic and thus predictable and stochastic, not at all predictable, and when agents are self-reflexive. Another way of thinking again about the scaffolding and the conditions under which these ecosystems have to thrive is understanding and thinking back about our supply chain considerations. These really efficient supply chains do well in peacetime, but are brittle when the conditions change and they suffer disruption. So how can we think about maybe instrumenting that scaffolding and thinking about the scaffolding itself as a way to sense when we would see things that are maladaptive start to emerge? Again, this is happening at a speed that humans usually can't keep up with. So this is a study here on the right, that looks at the prediction and control of cascade failures, like how many nodes in a network can fail before you see the emergence of what are known as dragon keying events. These are self-organized systems that emerge and then quickly cause catastrophic failure to the system. So you can think about this in terms of like traffic systems, whereas an interconnected web of GPS-guided people trying to find their fastest way home, and it works pretty well. But it relies on a subset of trusted nodes, for instance, traffic lights. We can handle it usually when a single traffic light goes out. But what happens when you get a lot of traffic lights go out? You see these cascading failures. So can we use this to know how many trusted nodes are necessary to keep a system healthy, to understand it when it might be becoming unhealthy? Thinking also now about tensions and how we need to maybe adapt or anticipate certain problems we see on the horizon as these human-machine teams scale. This came out of MIT's technology review, and it is a comparison of what the carbon footprint of a single transformer network, albeit a very, very big one, is compared to even the carbon footprint of a single human over a year, or even American over a year, which is considerably larger. And obviously, this is problematic. For if we put deep learning, if we put machine learning in as many areas as we think can help, this is probably not sustainable at scale. So as we think about developing more efficient computing to enable the systems and the societies we envision without imposing cost on our planet, maybe we can look to other areas, such as the human brain, for inspiration. You have to forgive me a little bit for this. I am a cognitive scientist, so I often look to the brain for inspiration, but in this case, I really do think it helps. The brain achieves higher levels of compute power than a mere fraction of the power that our artificial systems do. And they may offer system solutions for the scaling challenge. I mean, after all, it was the layered network of the brain that gave rise to the current deep learning revolution. So, and this is an example, this study out of Nature, a couple years old, but what it shows is the movement away from thinking about the brain as a single structure dedicated to a single task, and more about different areas of the brain being recruited in different combinations to achieve different tasks, which greatly increases the number of computations that can be supported. So maybe rather than building a new network for each new task, we can think about this. This also highlights how tensions can really drive the right kind of innovation. In this case, it's evolution, but the brain metabolically demands more than any other organ from our bodies, about 20 to 30% of our metabolic output, depending on how active you are. And it has limited real estate, limited space in the skull. Otherwise, we start seeing higher and higher infant mortality and mother mortality rates. So as a result, it's had to be really efficient. It was forced to be really efficient, and that tension has led to really impressive outcomes. So I'm not the first to think about this, right? I am not the first to think about this, of course. A lot of people look to the brain like this for inspiration. And this is one example of people who had to track. When are we going to get there? When are we going to get to this kind of efficiency and compute power? This was out of the Blue Brain project in 2014. And they projected how long it was going to be we would have a complete rat and human brain capacity in an artificial system. They predicted it's going to happen next year. Well, I'm a little skeptical, even if we in a brute force way push compute power just with extra servers. We might be able to get there, but we haven't reached anywhere near the efficiency. And often this is based on more of a limited role for understanding how many types of computation the brain is capable of, and how it spans across the structure from the cellular level to the network level to the whole brain level. Most we often think about are synaptic connections as being our digital counterparts in the brain. Gallistel and King demonstrated there aren't enough synaptic connections in the brain to support all of the computations that our brain takes on. So there must be other forms that exist. So maybe, instead, we think about scaling down before we scale up. And this actually aligns with something that really interesting came out about a year ago, in which we were able to model a single neuron, a single pyramidal neuron, which is a cortical neuron. And we were able to do it with only the use of 1,000 artificial neurons. So we're not there yet. But this is really promising. There's a lot of, again, across the scaffolding, across the structure, across the morphology of even a single neuron, there's a whole lot of computation we don't account for yet in our views. So there's a lot to be tapped into. So at the network level, we're also looking at things like analog to digital computation, as well as microstructures within the cell environment. So again, you'll forgive me for the cognitive science, delving into the cognitive science. It's my happy place. So aside from providing inspiration for artificial computation, we can again here look at this metaphor for understanding the incentives and conditions and tensions. For the incentives drive growth on the scaffolding itself through learning and development. The conditions, such as fear conditioning, can say, with extra serotonin, whether a memory is going to get laid down or made called in long-term potentiation, long-term memory. And then the tensions themselves that drive the signals. So it's just the cell membrane itself that creates the electrical potential that drives all computation in the brain. So again, the analogy is not perfect, but because the brain is self-reflexive at the cognitive level, where we can, through what we think about, change our brain structure through rumination, if it's maladaptive, or through positive thought or training and learning, if it's adaptive. I think there is a lot to be learned in this space. And indeed, there is some really positive and I think really inspirational examples of how productive tensions can produce better outcomes. We talked earlier about how incentives can do this as well. This particular study came from a guy out of University of Chicago, James Evans. He's going to be a speaker at our Washington State event, which is just in a couple weeks, so you might want to tune into that to hear from him. But this study gives me a whole lot of hope for a lot of things we're seeing today. In particular, it looked at the quality of Wikipedia articles across a number of different areas, science, politics, social issues, and found that the quality of the article increased with the increased polarization of the people that contributed to that article. Now, this didn't happen by accident. It was the structure that helped. It was this frequent, intense disagreement within politically polarized teams that, in this case, foments the focused debate, and as a consequence, resulted in higher quality edits that were more robust and more comprehensive, spanned greater set of conditions. The structure was key to making this disagreement productive as opposed to destructive. The point here is that unity of purpose can drive extraordinary outcomes, especially when we have diverse views. How do we harness that? And how we get the right scaffoldings in place to get more of this kind of outcome and result. You think, great, the internet is like the perfect area to get all of the cognitive diversity. I mean, is there any other place that has people with all of their opinions, however diverse they are? And yes, there is. There's greater access. But ironically today, even though we have access to much more information, there's actually fewer ideas out there. And this might be some of the reason why. Some of you might be familiar with this. This is a diagram out of Nature, which is illustrating what's known as Dunbar's number. Dunbar looked at the relationship between cortical size and the societal in-group of given organisms. There's a relationship there, and projected that it was about 150 is about the perfect in-group size for humans. Our social networks can support about 150. You think, wait a second, my LinkedIn profile is way bigger than that. That's not right. Maybe, but you can see there's variations on how close you are with individuals. I personally, as an introvert, don't interact with that many, so I'm on the lower end of that spectrum. But what this tells us, and actually looking at the median group size or the median network size on something like Facebook, it's about 200. I found this really surprising. But it suggests that there might be something here. Dunbar's number is pretty hotly debated, and that's fine. We like debates in Darpa. But what it does highlight is that even when we have access, the comp is that we're limited. If we're limited functionally by our own cognitive systems about how many networks and how many ideas, or how many people that we interact with, how many ideas we encounter, then composition of this network really matters, right? And so if we select for people that we agree with, and we select for ideas that we agree with, then we're inherently limiting the cognitive diversity that we have in our own network, and thereby erode that collective intelligence that these human-machine ecosystems can really help us with. There are so many positives of these platforms. I personally do not know how I would have survived the pandemic if I wasn't able to connect with my family on the West Coast. So the question is, again, like time zones, is there another innovation that can help us be more purposeful about how we create the scaffoldings to give rise to the portions we want? Now, science is also not, science is also part of this. This might be familiar to a number of you. This is a funnel plot. This is used in meta-analyses to diagnose whether you have something called a file drawer problem. For those of you in academia, you'll probably be very familiar with this. So with a funnel plot, you plot the effect sizes of studies that all study the same thing. Like, we've all seen the studies on, does red wine help you live longer? You can only imagine why there's been so many studies on that. And you will wonder, like, one says the effect size is really good, another one says not so good. Well, natural variation means that you're going to see a normal distribution across studies that are well done. You should see a normal distribution as the results naturally oscillate around the true effect size. But what we see is in this missing tail is an illustration and a diagnostic to say, at scale, where any number of these studies are probably perfect, all wonderful studies, that at scale we're missing something. And that this, the incentives here, whether it's publish or perish, or whether it is journals deciding that they really like to present and include results as opposed to null results, the incentives are part of what's driving this problem. Credit to some journals who are taking a very proactive stance on this and who are changing the incentives and making the agreements. I will publish your study based on the importance of the question and the quality of the methodology, as long as you pre-register and you tell me what your hypotheses are ahead of time and you don't do any hypothesizing after the fact. The point is that societies are already taking some self-reflective actions to do this, to develop the incentives to improve these outcomes at scale. So I'm going to end with the question we started with. How do we build the scalable human-machine ecosystems that are both prosperous and resilient? I've presented here just a few ideas, just to get the juices flowing, right? But I think there really is promise. The human-machine ecosystems, and in particularly with collective intelligence, to improve the greater well-being of not just the United States, but of humanity more generally. And going back again to thinking about Ukraine, the reason that Ukrainians have been able to fight back against a superpower in this true David and Goliath situation, one of the reasons is why that these information systems have been built to democratize the access and flow of information. That wasn't a mistake. And so I bring this up to say that technological development is not deterministic. It doesn't just happen. To think about, a priori, how do we build in what our social values are, what our values are into those systems at the get-go, democratization, the empowerment of the individual that helps give rise to the capabilities we want to see tomorrow. So in closing, I'll just say that I'm really excited to talk to all of you about how your ideas in this space. Again, what we've done so far, I'm excited about, but there's a lot more yet to be done, and we're going to need some help. So thank you so much for your time. So I think now we have some time for questions. Okay, here's one. On the topic of responsible AI, are we putting ourselves at a disadvantage if our adversaries are not constraining their AI in this way? It's a good question. So I would say no. I mentioned earlier, I think that, so DARPA's done some work in looking at how to develop processes for inserting LME, legal, moral, ethical considerations in that early paper to prototype stage of development. And at the outset, we had this question of, like, is it sort of inherently an assumption of ours that an ethical AI system is going to be inherently constrained? In a true DARPA way, we said, let's be empirical. We had a base system, and we had a system that had LME features built into it, extra transparency, traceability, et cetera. And what we found is that every time we had an LME feature, our test operators kept saying, who were former military, kept saying, nope, I need that feature to do my job. Put it in the base system, please. That's not an LME feature. That's just what I need to do to do my job. And that kept happening to the point where we had no LME system left. We only had a system imbued with LME features. So this upended my thinking in the space. It made me think, like, this is crazy. This means that the LME system, the one that encourages legal, oral, moral, ethical behavior, the one that extends the inherent virtue of the warfighter to take into account these features of traceability and transparency, as an example, was actually the more performant system. Because our warfighters are trained this way, then their systems have to extend that capability as well. So I actually think that we're going to be better off in the long run, in the same way that precision strike raised the bar for ethics on the international stage in the use of force. I think the same is true here, as long as we are purposeful about how we build those systems. So if these ecosystems are always changing and the systems are non-deterministic, how can we ever study, understand, and validate them rigorously? It's a great question. It's a hard question, too. Something that we've been grappling with in DARPA. We have to validate our systems when we want to make sure our metrics tell us what good looks like. We have to think about this. Even if we develop something that's perfect in simulation, how is it going to work in the real world? One approach, I'm not saying this is the only approach, but one approach that I have found to be useful is to think really carefully about the methodologies we use. The system itself is changing, and we know we can never have a perfect representation of it. Maybe instead we need more agile methodologies that can help keep up with the pace of change. And so if we make those measurement capabilities more agile, if they can keep up with those changes, they can be cheaper and more ubiquitous, then maybe we can get some traction against these thorny, non-ergodic systems. Okay, next question. Is it possible for automation and resilience to coexist? It's a good question, too. I think that, let me think about this one. I think so. I'm optimistic about this. If they couldn't coexist, then I think one of the programs that I'm currently running should probably not also exist. And I definitely don't want to say that. So yeah, I think, though, we have to think about how we define a system when we do this. If you talk about just the system sitting in a box on the table or on the tarmac, then maybe not. I don't think so. Then you have too much rigidity. But if you have our most adaptable asset, are humans, who know enough about that system and know enough about the quirks of automation, then hopefully they can adapt the system and use an old tool in a new way. I mean, we do this all the time, right? Using, again, I'll go back to grandmothers in Ukraine, using their smartphones as essentially intelligence collection systems. Tools they had available and using them in new ways. So I would say yes, as long as we empower that operator to understand enough about the system status, and probably about the context in which it's working, then I do think the human can use that system and adapt it on the fly. So yes, but with reservations. We have a lot of work to do before we get there. Okay, next question. So you said that complex systems are not deterministic. Won't there always be deterministic goals or outcomes that we can achieve, such as increases in decision speed? I think that we can always reach the goals, well, almost always reach the goals that we set out to achieve. So in the case for decision speed, as an example, that has been a major That has been a major goal of the OODA loop. For those of you who haven't heard about it, the observe, orient, decide, and act loop, where we try to get inside our enemy's decision cycle. We're thinking about that making our decisions faster and faster and faster has the adverse side effect of also leaning us more towards knee-jerk reactions as opposed to those thoughtful decisions. So if anybody's read Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman, you have read about this. We don't want to push all of our systems over to system 1 thinking. We want more of that deliberative system 2 thinking. Okay, I think I have time for maybe one more question. Is that right? So how does the concept you presented on Dunbar's number scale when thinking of face-to-face relationships versus online relationships? There has been some research on this question, actually. And I wish I could say I had the results in my back pocket. I don't. But it is interesting. There are differences. But I think that those differences are also changing. I can remember about 10 years ago when we were thinking about online people versus who we were online in like MySpace and was it Second Life, I think is what it was called? Who we were on the internet versus who we were in real life. I think in a lot of cases, those changes or those differences are narrowing, that there is less of a distinction between our online relationships and our face-to-face relationships. But again, it's dynamic, it's changing, and I don't know if we've discovered where that limit is yet. But if we can develop good methodologies to instrument it, I'd be very interested in finding out how. All right. So I just want to thank you all.